So in this series of lectures, we're going to talk about motor systems. And I want to draw your attention and remind you of the directional flow of information within the nervous system, whereas afferent is arriving information, and that's when mostly we think of sensory. In this cluster of lectures, we're going to talk about efferent, or exiting information, which is mostly motor. So motor information is information coming from the brain, going through the brainstem and spinal cord, out your spinal nerves, and it's information concerning movement going actually to your skeletal muscles. Motor behaviors or motor actions, we think of the terminology is, action or behavior, involves your entire CNS. It starts in the brain, in the premotor cortex. To motor cortex, it travels through the brainstem all the way down to the spinal cord, and then exits from the spinal cord ventral horn through the ventral roots to the spinal cord or the spinal nerves. I also want you to remember that there are two types of motor information and motor behaviors. There are the visceral efferents that are contained. The visceral efferent motor neurons are contained in the intermediolateral cell column, and those are they're going to exit with your ventral roots, and they're going to innervate hollow organs like your gut, your heart, your lungs, that kind of stuff. Those behaviors are a little bit harder to quantify, but you do know that you're breathing, and you do know that your heart is beating. The somatic efferent is what we're going to spend most of our time talking about, and those neurons are housed in the ventral horn, and again, those axons exit with the ventral rootlets and join the spinal nerves to distribute in the periphery to all of your muscles. So the take home from this brief introduction is to remember that efferent is motor. I want you to remember which parts of the CNS are involved in motor behaviors. What are the differences then between the somatic and the visceral motor neurons? Think about what they do and where they are. And then, and of course that leads right to the last one, which is where are your somatic and visceral motor neurons? If you understand these basic concepts, then you'll be ready for the assessment. In this segment of the lecture, we're going to discuss direct motor pathways. And remember that motor behaviors involve all parts of the nervous system, and so we're going to start at the top and work our way down to the bottom, starting with the brain. Motor information exits the brain, travels through the brainstem and spinal cord, and is associated with a set of nerves in your peripheral nervous system. The spinal nerves, which we've talked about in the spinal cord segments, and the cranial nerves, which are so special that they're going to get a whole lecture series all by themselves. So let's start at the very beginning, at the very top, in our premotor cortex. So we talked about the frontal lobe and how that's the area of your brain where you think and you plan and you make decisions. And so even before you're aware of wanting to get up and go to the refrigerator, it's all happening out here in your premotor cortex. Once you make that decision to actually get up out of your chair and walk over to the refrigerator, neurons in your precentral gyrus, which is your primary motor cortex, are going to become activated. We call these upper motor neurons. These neurons send out a very long axon, and we're going to spend the next several segments talking about where that axon travels. Once upper motor neuron in the precentral gyrus is activated, then that axon is going to travel through a great big fiber pathway within the central nervous system called the internal capsule. And you can see it here. So here's the internal capsule. This is a coronal section. And in a horizontal section, horizon, oh, I can't spell, never mind. In this horizontal section, you can see the internal capsule here. It's this big fiber band. The neurons that we're going to be talking about in the motor cortex that go to the spinal cord to interact with neurons that are going to contribute to your spinal nerves are all traveling in the posterior limb. We'll talk about the posterior limb of the posterior limb of the internal capsule is associated with motor behaviors, basically below the neck. Motor neurons that are going to innervate the targets in the brainstem that innervate your cranial nerves, so that the cranial nerves innervate structures in your head and neck. Those primary or upper motor neurons still live up here, but they travel in a special place called the genu, or the bend of the internal capsule. So the genu is going to be motor behaviors above the neck. And what we didn't talk about in a lot of detail in the sensory areas is that the anterior limb is going to be carrying some sensory information. But don't worry about that. We covered all we're going to cover with the sensory systems. Once the axons of those upper motor neurons actually leave the brain proper, they become the crus cerebri. And you can see this on the ventral side of the brainstem. And if you make a section through this, through the brainstem, it looks like this. This is the image that you're going to see if you look at a neuronal axis, an atlas of the nervous system. We now call these fibers, first they were just kind of a random assortment of axons, then they all came together in the internal capsule. Now that they're outside the brain, we call them the crus cerebri. And I'm really sorry about this. I'm really sorry that this tract changes names so many times as it goes from the top of the brain all the way down to the spinal cord. I wasn't there when they named it, so but I apologize for my predecessors. But in their defense, they didn't really understand that these were the exact same axons traveling from one place to the other. So they basically just kind of named them for where they could see them. So this is the image that you will see in an atlas, with this being dorsal and this being ventral. And this is the image that you kind of see if you just cut this and then looked at it straight, because you can see the crus cerebri is up, and here's the crus cerebri again. So I just flipped it so that you'd understand that it's the same structure, just from two different points of view. In the next segment, we'll take up the crus cerebri and how these fibers then travel through the pons and the medulla in the rest of the brainstem. In this segment, we'll take up those fibers that were traveling from the primary motor cortex through the internal capsule, through the crus cerebri of the midbrain, and now they're in the pons. And in the pons, these motor fibers are now they're not a solid structure anymore. They're running in between a bunch of gray matter. This is, let me take a minute to explain. This particular section of the brainstem, the pons, is stained with something that stains all of the white matter. It stains it dark because it's a myelin stain. And so it kind of looks like gray and white matter are reversed, because the white matter is dark and the gray matter, such as these group of neurons here and these groups of neurons all through here, are now light because they're not stained. So back to our motor pathways. It started in the motor cortex, traveled through the internal capsule, went through the crus cerebri, and now in the pons, it's kind of interspersed with a bunch of different neurons, clusters of neurons in the pons. Once this fiber path hits the medulla, it recoalesces and becomes the pyramid. The reason it's called the pyramid is because on the outside of the medulla, you can see how this surface is got these two kind of large lumps. And these large lumps, when you're looking at the brainstem, are kind of like this and like this. And there's a kind of a divot down here in the middle. There's another lump out here that you can actually see here. The olivary complex makes another lump, and they called it the olive because I guess they were hungry. It looks like an olive. But these two structures on either side are the pyramids, and they look like long ridges, long kind of triangular ridges that run along the base of the brainstem, hence their name, the pyramids. But again, it's the same axon of this upper motor neuron that traveled through the internal capsule, through the medulla, through the midbrain in the crus cerebri, through the pons as these kind of distributed, and now comes together as the pyramid in the medulla. A little further down within the medulla is what we call the pyramidal decussation. And decussation just means cross. This is where the motor fibers cross the midline, and you can see all those fibers crossing here. Up above, all of the fibers are on the same side. So left hemisphere, left midbrain, left pons, left medulla, until you get down to the bottom of the medulla, and then they cross over. Okay? This decussation or crossing is actually an important term or an important region to be aware of, because this is the definition of where the brainstem stops and the spinal cord begins. In the next segment, we're going to talk about how this pathway that started in the with our upper motor neurons and traveled through the brainstem crosses, now that it's crossed, is going to go into the spinal cord, and then we're going to call it the corticospinal tracts, and that's what we'll talk about next. In this segment, we'll talk about that final bit of the direct motor pathway, and we call it the corticospinal tract. And it's called corticospinal because it starts in the cortex and it ends in the spinal cord. So the same motor neuron that started way up there in our motor cortex with our upper motor neuron has finally crossed the midline. Now it's come down to the spinal cord. We have the lateral corticospinal tract, which travels here, and it innervates, these are descending fibers, and it innervates the limbs. The ventral corticospinal tract is here. It is about half crossed and half uncrossed, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide or two. And it's going to innervate the trunk muscles, and the trunk muscle neurons live here. Limb motor neurons live here. Remember when we talked about the spinal cord and we talked about the cervical and lumbar enlargements, you have all those extra neurons that innervate the muscles of your upper extremity and your lower extremity. So it makes sense that that lateral corticospinal tract travels here, so it's right next to its target neurons. So again, the corticospinal tracts, lateral and ventral, travel here. And they synapse then on what are called lower motor neurons, also known as alpha motor neurons. And these are great, big, beautiful motor neurons that send their axons then out through the ventral rootlets, the ventral roots, which then join with the dorsal to form the spinal nerve. And then these are all of the named nerves that we talked about when we talked about the plexes in peripheral nerves 2 back in the spinal cord lecture. And so one thing I forgot to mention in the last slide that I want to catch you up on this slide is, again, because the lateral corticospinal tract is over here, ventral here, these are the neurons for the trunk. These are the neurons for the limbs. This tract, the ventral, is about half crossed and about half uncrossed. This is because your trunk moves as a whole. I can't do half a sit-up. I can twist, but my whole trunk moves together. I can't move parts of my thorax or part of my abdomen independent because it's one unit. And so because you want it to move as a unit, you want information from both sides of your brain talking to both sides of your body. So half is crossed and half isn't. When it comes to the lateral corticospinal tract, that is totally crossed, just like your sensory systems. So sensation from my right arm is being perceived on the left side of my brain. When it comes to moving my right arm, those motor neurons are on the left side of my brain, and they cross in that pyramidal decussation at the bottom of the medulla, and then will innervate the motor neurons, the alpha motor neurons, in the spinal cord of my right spinal cord, and innervate then my right arm. So just to reiterate, lateral corticospinal tract, completely crossed. Left brain works right arm. Ventral corticospinal tract, trunk, both sides of my brain are talking to both sides of my body. Okay? So this is getting down to the last, let me erase this part. And this is getting now down to the last part of this direct motor pathway, in which we're talking about our beautiful alpha motor neurons that live here, sending their information out to the actual muscles. And those then, so it's corticospinal tract, one neuron, all the way up in motor cortex that has sent its axon, all the way down through the internal capsule, through the brainstem, partially halfway down, or maybe all the way down our spinal cord to synapse on this alpha motor neuron. This alpha motor neuron now takes that information and exits through the spinal nerves, and then goes out to innervate the muscles. And now I want to remind you of how this actually works, in that, remember, we have our beautiful alpha motor neuron coming out and innervating muscle fibers. And I want you to remember a motor unit, and that's the number of muscle fibers innervated by one alpha motor neuron. This is going to determine how fine the control is, because a ratio of one neuron to 100 muscle fibers is going to give you really fine control. One neuron to 1,000 motor fibers is going to give you kind of large gross motion, big broad movements, not fine control. The way that the neuron talks to, or more official and more scientific terms, synapses with the muscle fibers, is called a neuromuscular junction. And the neuromuscular junction is a very special connection between the neuron, the motor neuron in the ventral horn, and the muscle fibers out in your peripheral muscles. This is a very special relationship. Muscles need neurons. You know that if there's a damage within a nerve or within the spinal cord, that muscle will atrophy if it's not innervated. And neurons need muscles. Muscles make all kinds of growth factors and things that then influence the health and well-being of this alpha motor neuron. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship between the neuron and the motor fibers. In summary, what I really want you to remember is that efferent, of course, equals motor. That I want you to know where your upper motor neurons are. I want you to be able to describe the path of that upper neuron axon all the way through the internal capsule and brainstem and all the way down to the spinal cord. And then, where do those upper motor neurons synapse? What's their target? What's a lower motor neuron? Where do the motor neurons, lower motor neurons live? Then what is the path that the axons of those neurons take to get out to the muscle? And then where do those lower motor neurons synapse, and what do we call it? If you know all of these things, you're going to be ready for the assessment.